Okay, so I want to say welcome and thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's windblown. It's a very traditional New Mexico spring evening. So we get a bear bath. So that's great to know. I just want to say before we look at Joel's presentation tonight, that we have a couple of speakers on deck for the fall. Looks like Dr. Jeff Shepherd from UTEP is going to have a talk for us in the fall, and also potentially somebody from the, oh, sorry, I'm just wanting them to see me, not them. I can't see that over the computer. And it looks like we also potentially have somebody that will be coming over from the Hillsborough County Historical Society to give a talk. Both of those talks are to be determined at this point, but so we got some things kind of lined up for the fall as well. And potentially also Dr. Brandon Morgan coming down from Albuquerque to give a talk on the Columbus raids over in Columbus, New Mexico, the Punta raids. So that will either happen in the fall or the spring. That's definitely going to happen for sure. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that as well. So tonight we have Joel Parra speaking tonight. His talk is going to look at the repatriate colonies. These colonies include La Mesilla, Santo Tomas, Refugio, and Lucia, were established along the U.S. border for those Mexican citizens who did not wish to stay in land conquered by the United States following the Mexican-American War. Joel Gonzalez Parra is a McNair Scholar. He also is graduating next month from NMSU with a BA in history, so we should congratulate him on that. And so tonight he's going to talk about this 9th century repatriation. So I will turn it over to Joel. Thank you.
Sorry, we have to tend to our Zoom folks also. Okay. Hello, good evening. Before I start, I want to make a quick question. How many of you have been at Mesilla, an old Mesilla in the plaza, looking at the old buildings? Yeah? Well, I gotta say this topic is born out of my experience just wandering around the old Mesilla Plaza. It was very striking for me as someone born in the United States and raised in Mexico to look at the flags commemorating the change of jurisdiction of that region. And once I started doing more research, at first just out of curiosity, it was really it was a big surprise to me to realize that Mesilla wasn't really a unique event when it comes to people wrestling with being part of the United States, part of Mexico, having doubts about where they really stand. But there were actually many other towns, not only in New Mexico, but also in the state of Chihuahua and all along the US-Mexico border. I need to give it some time to react. There we go. So before I go into more detail about the people, the New Mexicans that moved from New Mexico to Chihuahua, I want to show you the relevant points. I'll start with some context about where New Mexico stood during the Mexican period and during the Mexican-American War. We'll look at the colonization decrees, the laws issued by the government of Mexico in their attempt to bring the people that were lost to the new border, the New Mexico Commission, because we have commissions in Texas and California also, but the most important one was the New Mexican Commission. We'll look at some of these first towns that were settled around 1849, just 1 year after the conclusion of the war. And then we'll take a look at some of the dynamics. How did people live in this time and in this region during this process? So first of all, I want to say that in New Mexico, at least I have realized that there's a perception that New Mexico was fairly isolated from the rest of the Mexican Republic and from the rest of the Spanish Empire, even before that. And the Mexican government, once they achieved independence in 1821, they were really aware of this. And they knew that their national security relied on securing the northern border, populating especially. What's the issue? You have a lot of civil war, of civil conflict in Mexico when they just became independent. So it was really hard to allocate resources and to implement any policy that will help develop the northern region. Then you have the Texan experience. When you bring colonies from Texas, we know that it didn't go well. And we have this permanent issue with Native American groups. It was one of the reasons why colonists didn't moved from central Mexico and other parts of the world to this northern region was a constant warfare against Native Americans. It's also interesting to see how, in the absence of a strong federal government, the church will try to step up and be that, let's say, that paternal figure towards New Mexico. New Mexicans for a while face a lack of priests in this region. We need to remember that at this time, the, the archbishop was in Durango. You have New Mexico, then you have Chihuahua, and then Durango. It was very far away, the former region of Nueva Vizcaya. So in the 1830s is when finally we have one of these bishops trying to be more involved with the New Mexican communities. And something that you see is that they come to New Mexico, they take young people in New Mexico that wants to be instructed in the church, and then they send them back. And later on, we'll see how these fathers will be some of the leaders in the repatriation process after the war. You also have a growing relationship with the United States. You might have heard about the Santa Fe Trail. Well, New Mexicans, especially in the northern region, became very dependent of trade with the United States. There's some data from the 1840s where it is stated that 70% of the territory's budget comes from trade with the United States. And then because of that weak connection with the Mexican government and because of growing trade and relationship with the United States, you have people having doubts about the national allegiances when the war starts. By the end of the war, it is that New Mexicans, as well as any other people in the ceded territories, will have up to 1 year to decide if they want to become Americans or if they want to relocate south the new border. Of course, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion about the role of the people in the new nation. I have to state that it was just a minority of New Mexicans who decided to relocate, but it's really interesting to see the motives why most of them stayed. People make some quick assumptions saying, well, it was as easy as saying, I want to be American or I want to be Mexican. But we will see later that there were a lot of factors that accounted for people making this kind of decision. You have the colonization decrees, on the first one on July of 1848, issued by President José de Joaquín Herrera. This first decree was to establish military colonies. Most of the presidios, are we familiarized with the concept of presidio? So for those who are not that familiar, the presidios were like this military post in the Spanish Empire limits. if you take a look at the ceded territories, many of these presidios were now on the American side. San Elizario, Socorro, Senecú, Isleta, down the river in El Paso. The Californian missions, they remain in American territory. So Mexico now is trying to create new military outposts, but now they don't want to bring people from central Mexico as they used to before. Now they want to bring the people in the new territories of the United States, as they know that they will be like the ideal immigrants, right? They're not part of the nation anymore, but they were at some point. So there won't be issues about adaptation, language, customs. The second decree, and this is the most important for the towns that we'll be taking a look into, is a decree of August 19 of 1848. This is not just military colonies. Now we're talking about civil colonies. And the border was divided in three parts. And we'll be focusing on the Frontera de Chihuahua, the Chihuahuan frontier. The Chihuahuan frontier was assigned to be the track of the border where New Mexican families and modern day Arizona will be relocated in the state of Chihuahua. And for this, there was a commission that was set up in 1849. The first commissioner of colonies was Father Ramon Ortiz, born in Santa Fe. As I mentioned before, he was one of those young guys who were sent to study down in Durango with Bishop Subiria, who was known to be a Mexican patriot and had some anti-Americanism in him. And Ramon Ortiz is one of his students, right? So he's one of the first ones to be on board with the idea of relocating as many New Mexicans as possible. If you are familiar with his name, is because you can read about him in the Mesilla Plaza. He's memorialized there as one of the leaders of the group of people that settled there. But he was also very active in relocating people in Chihuahua. And we'll take a look later into some of his reports on this commission task around all of New Mexico. Later on, you have Guadalupe Miranda. Guadalupe Miranda, he was born in Paso del Norte, which is modern day Ciudad Juárez, but he moved at a very young age to Santa Fe and he made a family up there. He became Secretary of State. Well, not a state, of the territory of New Mexico back in the day. And after the Mexican-American War, he will relocate again to Paso del Norte. He became a vice consul for modern day El Paso. And he was also a commissioner of colonies when Ramon Ortiz was removed from that position. Something very interesting, as I mentioned, not many people relocated, but when you read the reports, the letters sent by Ramon Ortiz, he explains how once the New Mexican authorities realized how many people had some interest in relocating, they just started to prohibit any commission, and they created a lot of barriers for these commissioners to be able to bring people. He describes, for example, that the first town he visited was in San Miguel del Vado, which was thought by the New Mexican authorities to be one of the places where there was no interest at all for relocation. But then Ortiz explains that out of the 1,000 families that were there, 900 of them signed up for repatriation. And after that, Ramon Ortiz was called by Governor Donaciano Vigil in Santa Fe, telling him that he had no permission anymore to keep the commission in Santa Fe. There was some negotiations. He was allowed not to be in the towns personally, but to send other representatives that the government thought that will be less popular among the people. But again, Ortiz describes that when his representative for Santa Fe put up some notes around town, some handmade flyers. After 3 hours of spreading the word of the commission, there were two asking to be enlisted for repatriation. After that, again, Father Ortiz was called by the governor in Santa Fe, and he was told that the Mexican government shouldn't be doing any business of that kind in the territory. And when he describes some of the tactics that were to impede the work of the commission, he describes that based on accounts that he gathered when he was in New Mexico, that first of all, I mentioned that people were given 1 year, right, to decide whether to relocate or to stay in the United States. But the government in Washington, D.C. and the government in Mexico City didn't really set up a formal process to follow to provide these declarations. And the New Mexican government took advantage of that vagueness of the statement to impede people from being enlisted. Governor Donaciano Vigil told Ramon Ortiz that he will help the commission just by handing him the list of people who had personally attended the governmental offices and asked to be enlisted as a Mexican citizen. But then talking to people in the area, Ramon Ortiz was told that will refuse the recently born newspapers in Santa Fe how to proceed with this declaration. The newspapers at first
Sorry, we had to have a stable internet connection. We kind of bumped everything up. So the people online not there. Thank you.
So I would like to resume saying that Mesilla is known because of its peculiar history, especially with the relocation of families. But interestingly, it wasn't the only colony that was set up in what became New Mexican territory. You had La Mesilla, but you had. Mhm.
Did it go off again? Just click behind it again.
Has a mind of its own. So I mean, as you can see in the map, you had La Mesilla almost on the top of this map, but you also had other two colonies in New Mexican territory, Santo Tomás de Iturbide, which seems to be on the lands that belong today to the Stallman farms, and then the town of La Union, really close to the Texan boundary. It was also one of these colonies, which was called Refugio back in the day. Not only you had those towns in the Yellow Territory, which was part of the Gadsden Purchase. That's when jurisdiction to the US was completed. But all along the river, you also see these towns being populated. First, you have Guadalupe, San Ignacio, which is modern day Prajeris Guerrero. If you want to have a better image of it, these two towns are located right across the river from Favens, Texas. You also had the town of Zaragoza, which was settled during the American Civil War period from repatriates from Isleta, Doña Ana, and Mesilla. And that town technically doesn't exist anymore because it was absorbed by modern day Ciudad Juarez. But if you have gone to Isleta, or if you have crossed to Juarez through the Zaragoza International Bridge, well, it's called Zaragoza as a remnant of the town that was once there. And then one of the most studied colonies, you have Ascension, which is one of the last ones to be formed by New Mexican repatriates after some political events that took place in the Plaza of Mesilla. So something really interesting, something I want to take a deeper look at is the birthplaces of the people who relocated to these towns. In 1852, that is 4 years after the conclusion of the war, officials in Canton Bravos, which was like the municipality of modern day Ciudad Juarez, when they collected the census, they were aware that there was an influx of people coming in from other territories. So they made sure that those who were listing the colonies will also list the birthplace to have a count of where these people were moving from. In the towns of Guadalupe and San Ignacio, there was a total population of 1,247 colonists, and almost half of them, 550, were New Mexican born. Not all of them specified the town. Some of them did. We'll see how 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 that helps us to have a better sense of why the colonists took that decision. As you can see, I also included San Elizario and Socorro. I'm aware that these are not New Mexican towns, but I think they will help the study because they sit right across the border. So it will help us make a comparison and see it being right across the border kind of help the colonists to make up their mind and move to these new towns. Here we have a better breakup where I place the 7 New Mexican towns that provided most colonists to these towns. You can see Tomé, Belén, Socorro, New Mexico, referring the census as Socorrito to differentiate from Socorro, Texas, Manzano, Sabino, Sabinal, and Valencia. And something really interesting, and that's why I have the map right next to this list, is that as you can see in the map, this is just like a section of central and south New Mexico. When you look at the census, people coming from the north, there were not many of them. For example, Santa Fe, it just provided 3 colonists. Albuquerque, something like 4 or 5. The people was moving from central and south New Mexico. I was also able to find a list that provided the birthplaces of every one of the 1,783 colonists of La Mesilla in 1852. It's interesting to see first how pretty much the bulk of the population was moving from Paso del Norte, Ciudad Juárez. A good part of them were born in New Mexico, but then see how people were coming from pretty much everywhere. These towns were for New Mexicans, yes, that was the idea, but they also attracted a lot of people from other places simply because the Mexican government was providing free lands to those who decided to relocate. So exploring the motifs, I wanted to take a look at the birthplaces to then explain these motifs and how they relate with the region where the people were coming from. As I mentioned, most of the repatriates were coming from the Rio Abajo area. And something to keep in mind, going back to this idea of trading with the United States and the cultural connections with Mexico, is that when we talk about the Santa Fe Trail, there was a lot of people making a profit, but it was usually in the northern region, right? It was the most populated region. And the towns in central and south New Mexico were scarce because there were smaller towns. They had less connections with the Santa Fe Trail, so they depended more on local or regional economies. They were also prone to Indian raids. They were closer to the border, which made it easier for colonists to relocate. And again, the lands being allotted by the Mexican government was a really good incentive for those peasants who didn't really have much back in the towns where they were born. You can see here a little breakdown. I've been able to find documentation for a little bit over 1,500 New Mexicans moving from New Mexico to these colonies in the first years after the war. As I said, it's not that much when you take in mind that the first American census of the territory counted up to 65,000 people. But it will be really interesting to see the dynamic that these people play in this new border, because it was such a depopulated border that once you have this calling in, they are creating towns of regional importance that sit right in the international boundary, and some pretty interesting dynamics will take place. The Mexican government was really concerned about creating these towns for national security, especially to avoid new Indian raids coming deeper into the country, also to try to fend off any American aggression, as there was a lot of filibustering taking place at the time. But life wasn't that easy. It wasn't as easy as people coming, taking new free land, and then all of a sudden you have a happy town, right? It's really interesting to see the different dynamics that took place in this new border as people are wrestling not only with national allegiances, but they're just trying to survive. And if they can take advantage of opportunities on both sides of the border, as we'll see, they'll do. First of all, there was constant conflict over land titles. There were many people within the same colonies that saw an opportunity with this free land, not just to take whatever plots the government was was giving out, but also trying to make businesses. You can see even if rich people were just a minority of the colonies coming in, it's interesting to see that some of the people that had more influence in the new towns were people that already have a good position in those towns that they left. And there's an interesting concept that I kind of came up with, which is extended families, that you see people that are relocating, but they're still in contact with those regions that they left. When looking into genealogical data of some of the first colonies, it's interesting to see how their offsprings, their children, some of them will go back to the towns where they were born. They will marry into local families, but they still keep their connections in the towns that were founded on the Mexican side of the border. Border unrest, as I mentioned before, you had the gas and purchase that created a lot of uncertainty in regions like Mesilla, Santo Tomas, and Refugio, especially because it's one of the clearest examples of how both the United States and Mexico are wrestling with this idea of imposing their own nation state projects, right? When you read documents of the year that precedes the Gadsden Purchase, when you read into the incident where the New Mexican governor at the time said that he will take Mesilla by force if it was necessary, you have a exchange of documentation where officials from both sides are like cherry picking details about the creations of these towns in order to favor the narrative of their nations, right? For example, the New Mexico governor, he listed some of the legal reasons why Mesilla should be part of New Mexico because we had that border dispute, right? You have the Rio Grande as a natural border of the US, Texas, and Mexico. And once the Rio Grande reaches El Paso, modern day El Paso, Texas, then you have that straight line. Not that straight, but a more artificial line. Because the initial map that was used for the treaty located El Paso to be 40 miles north from where it really is, then you have that dispute over La Mesilla being Mexican or American territory. You have the governor of New Mexico listing those legal reasons, but then he tries to make a case saying that because the Mexican government is not able to provide enough protection to these colonies, they should be the ones in charge of the region. Also, you have the press machinery behind it. You have newspapers in Santa Fe downplaying the number of New Mexican families that relocated in this region, saying that there was no case to be made about New Mexicans this preferring Mexico over the United States because all the families were from El Paso. So the case was that if people is coming from Juarez and not from New Mexico, that means that the people in Mesilla want to be American and not Mexican. Then you have replies from Chihuahua officials opposing, right? Saying the families come from New Mexico. They don't say most of them come from El Paso or most of them come from New Mexico and then others from Mexico. The Chihuahua governor says families come from New Mexico. So that means that New Mexicans don't want to be part of the United States. And you have these people being caught up in the middle of that struggle. And when you see their political declarations, it's just this mix of intentions that for me just speak for political survival. Ramon Ortiz was sent once again to Mesilla to try to settle some issues with land titles. And when he does, some of the people do not receive him well, saying that if Mesilla is to be part of the United States, then there's no case for Mexican officials to do so many arrangements in the area. This raised some suspicions to who asked for a secret committee for an investigation to be made in these colonies to point out to those traitors, in his words, to those traitors who are agitating the people to disobey the Mexican government and accept the new American government. But at the same time, you have colonists in Mesilla, as well as Santo Tomas and Refugio, creating manifestos or political declarations in support of some of the revolutionary movements that are taking place in Mexico. And it's interesting to see that because they're doing so even after the Gadsden Purchase has been consumed. So you have people in their way trying to declare their allegiance to Mexico, others simply accepted the new American government because of local struggles. But at the same time, documentation of this place shows you that people are just trying to maneuver these two political forces to be in the good side of whoever ends up ruling the La Mesilla at the end. As you can see, there are migration waves. In 1863, you have the case of Zaragoza, as I mentioned. It's not clear how many people migrated to Zaragoza. There's no surviving census or records from that year. What we know is that initially, people from Isleta, Texas, once the Civil War broke out and Confederate forces were crossing the area, actually on their way to La Mesilla in New Mexico, because of the conflicts that these troops are creating in the region, many people decide to escape that. But in doing so, they want to take advantage of the provisions for colonies that the Mexican government has. So they know that even if they could just relocate temporarily in Mexico while any conflict goes away in the United States, they ask for permission to settle in order to receive the free lands that the Mexican is giving out to colonists that are living in foreign territory. After people in Isleta did this, you have petitions coming in from Mesilla and Doña Ana. And as I mentioned, well, it's not clear how many people relocated to this town of Zaragoza. It must have been a successful enterprise because at the same time, you have reports coming from Guadalupe asking for extensions in land. So those colonies that are coming from El Paso area can be adequately relocated in the town. 1872, I don't know if any of you is more familiar with this event. In 1871, you have a political riot taking place in La Mesilla. You have both Republicans and Democrats rallying around the plaza. Things got out of hand. There's a shooting where it is said that 8 to 9 people got killed, some dozens were injured, more than 500 shots fired. And after that, the dissatisfied group decided to take their stuff and relocate once again to Chihuahua. And I say once again because looking at the records, there are families that moved first from Ciudad Juárez to Doña Ana. They moved once again to Mesilla, and they still live enough to relocate to Ascension in 1972. Just a few who were able to do that, but they were still there, constantly trying to take advantage of the situations that one or other country could offer. They relocated in 1872, created the town of Ascension, which today has around 15,000 inhabitants. It's probably the most successful of the towns that were settled in Chihuahua. And something really interesting about this is that, as it happened with La Mesilla in the year before the Gadsden Purchase, you have again different accounts that try to appeal to different sentiments and reasons of why people relocated. When they send a letter to the church down in Durango asking for Father Baca, who was in Mesilla, to be transferred to Ascension, they use a very patriotic language, right? They say that they have relocated to Ascension because they were not happy with the Gadsden Purchase, and they had been in Mesilla in some sense against their will. That's how they frame it. Similar language is used when they send letters to the Mexican president to give them the land that they needed, saying that they're so happy to be again in the beautiful Mexican soil. But then when you see private correspondence, you see a change in the language, right? And the reasons why people moved. An immigration commission was created in Ascension. They call it La Comisión Central de Migración, the Central Commission for Immigration. And when you read the letters that they send to people in Mesilla, the language changes, right? Because in official correspondence, they talk about coming back to Mexico because they're Mexicans. But when they send correspondence to Mesilla, they're talking about emigration for the Republicans who were in the region. So seems like their immigration effort, of course, was political motivated, but then they sell it to officials in Mexico as a patriotic endeavor so they can facilitate the relocation of these families. Something else interesting is that even if they were not happy with the outcomes of the elections and the political disturbances that took place in Mesilla, they didn't really break the relationship with the people there. One of my favorite examples is Remigio Sainz. Remigio Sainz was born in Mesilla the same year that the Gadsden Purchase was concluded, and he was one of the founding families of Ascension. But it's interesting because he seems to have kept really good influences in Mesilla to the point that when a riot broke out in 1892 because of land issues in Ascension, some of the rebels fled to Mesilla, claiming that they had nothing to do with the revolt and that Mexican authorities couldn't really prosecute them because they were citizens of the United States. And then there's an extradition process where Remigio Sainz is the only one to actually be able to prove he's a US citizen despite being a resident of Ascension for 20 years at that point. After that, he will go back to Ascension. He was arrested for a while, but he even hold political charges. He hold office of this town in the early 1900s. Other example, which I think it's very specific to how people is constantly moving back and forth depending on their needs, is Aniceto Vaca. Aniceto Vaca was the brother of Father Vaca. He was married to one of the colonists that first relocated in Guadalupe. His wife was born in New Mexico, was relocated as a child in Guadalupe. They met in Mesilla. And then you have this really interesting archival record where you see the 1880 census of the United States. They are listed as residents of Mesilla. 1890, they are again listed as residents of Mesilla. But when you look between that period of time, all the records are Mexican records. Yes, they're living 1 year in Mesilla, but then happens that their children are being baptized in Casas Grandes, the church that in that time was affiliated with the Church of Ascension. So you see how people is constantly moving depending on their needs. And seems like a border that was put by both countries with really specific purposes in mind, purposes that often were thought to have a really consolidated border, a meaningful border to avoid uh, illegal trade, to avoid the entrance of foreign people into the country. It didn't really matter at all for the colonists. They played along with it in order to satisfy their needs. But whenever the issues arose, they were really quick to change to one side and the other. You also have some revolts in Guadalupe. Guadalupe is one of the towns that had the most New Mexican people in it. And by that I say that pretty much all the inhabitants of the town were New Mexican. So it seems like they wanted to retain some of that political autonomy that they used to have in New Mexico, because again, the distance made people rely a lot on this on themselves. And when they saw that the municipal authority was being chosen by officials in Ciudad Juarez, they revolted. They revolted. They fled to a town called Butchville, Texas, which I haven't been able to trace back to this day. And they will only come back when the Chihuahua government threatened them to taking away their property if they were to remain in the United States. So yes, the Mexican government wanted to use a very patriotic language. The United States proud itself of saying that most of the people stayed in New Mexico because for them that will prove that the American system was superior. But people will fluctuate a lot depending on their local circumstances. I've been able to conduct some research in Ascension. These are some of the photos that I wanted to show. Really interesting because there's not a lot of historical memory about La Mesilla in Ascension. You won't find a lot of markers. There's just one marker, and you can see it's kind of deteriorated right now. They haven't taken much care of it, but some of it remains in the memory of some of the oldest generations. And instead of memorials, they come up as businesses. For example, the blue businesses, that's a laundromat. Who called it La Mesilla and why? I haven't been able to figure. The other store on the top, as you can see, it's not working anymore. But again, they use La Mesilla as a way to commemorate the founders of the town. That stop sign, I don't know if you're able to read it that well, but it's one of the main streets in the central plaza called Dos Naciones, which means two nations. The church, and inside the Church of Ascension, you have this figure. Don't take my word on this one because I haven't been able to fully corroborate the story. But one of the accounts I read about people moving from Mesilla to Ascension is first that one of the bands that was involved in the riot was used during the march to scare off any Indian parties that could be nearby. And second one, there's in one of those accounts, it is said that one of the families decided to take a figure of a virgin that was inside the San Albino now Basilica. And if the accounts are true, that's a figure that we're taking a look into, which has been there since the town was founded. That said, I want to share some of the bibliography and the archives that I consulted. Many of the documentation comes from the Ciudad Juarez Municipal Archives. You can find a microfilm copy at New Mexico State University, as well as the archives from the Archbishop of Durango. Also, there was some work made in the New Mexico State Record Center and Archives at UNM. And the sources that you can see there are just a few of them. But if you are interested in reading more about the topic, I will recommend you to start with those works listed there. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes,
I noticed that you did not mention the village of Doña
Doñana.
which petition was in September 1839,
Mhm,
and it was approved, and they settled it in January of 1843.
mhm.
So the colony was initially a colony from El Paso del Norte,
Yes.
and during that 3-year period, they had a dispute as to whether it should be under Chihuahua or under El Paso del Norte, and eventually decided it would be under the government of Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua. So anyway, but you didn't mention it. I mean, it was founded, of course, when this area was still part of Mexico.
Mhm. Yes, in the Juarez archives, as you mentioned, because there was that dispute, some of the land titles, you can still access them in the Juarez Municipal Archives, as well as a census of the first families that were there. I didn't focus too much in Doña Ana because, as you mentioned, it was founded in the Mexican period, and it didn't really correspond to this initiative by the Mexican government of relocating that people that were now in the United States. Of course, because of how close it was, there were a lot of interactions with the town. One of the interesting things that I didn't mention is that during the first years after Guadalupe and San Ignacio were founded, there's some documentation of officials in Doña Ana expressing some concerns that now that those towns are down there and that some of the people that moved there come from New Mexican towns, now there are criminals and other people trying to use that new boundary as a way to escape any prosecution in the US. But yeah, that's mainly the reason why I didn't focus too much on Doña Ana, because I wanted to shed more light on the towns that were created with the intention of relocating people that were now in the US.
One other thing that's kind of interesting is during the dispute with Governor Lane over whether or not the state was part of Mexico.
Yes.
Or whether it was part of Chihuahua, and there were a lot of arguments on both sides. But right after Lane issued his proclamation, Governor Trias
Mhm.
came down from Chihuahua and occupied Mesilla.
2,000
He had
troops.
several cannon, had about 400 troops. He occupied it down for about 3 or 4 months.
And if you read, for example, the correspondence of David Diefenderfer, who was consul at Paso del Norte, he will even say that there were about 2,000 troops in Mesilla, and that and requesting US troops because he feared that if violence broke out, the Mexicans might take the opportunity to do whatever they could on the American side of the border. Yes.
Because I found this talk super fascinating because it's it kind of fills in the holes of like the way that we think about New Mexico history at this time.
Mhm.
It's this large sort of overview of what's kind of going on along the border, and we're able to kind of really bring in a lot of local history and these local connections about. So my question is really like, you really drove home the point that people were really taking advantage of whatever country could help them, right? If it's next month, it's Mexico giving us the better deal, then we're gonna take advantage of that, and vice versa with the United States. But I wonder what you think about if you could let us know, like, how did this shape identity? Because it kind of seems like if you're hopping up over the side of the border all the time, and you're claiming these different nationalities and these different, one day you're New Mexican, the next you're a Texan, the next you're like Chihuahuan, like, how do people start to identify? And did that always kind of change too? Are they sometimes Texans? Are they sometimes Americans? Are they sometimes Mexican, sometimes Mexican? And do you see that a lot in any of the sort of work that you looked at in the archive?
They don't talk too much about personal identity. One of the conclusions I came with is that one of the reasons why they have the freedom to move that much within one side of the border and the other in the first place is because first in New Mexico, you didn't have that much of American influx at first. There wasn't too many American people coming to this area. They will go to California, they will go to Texas, but not much in New Mexico. So at first, I don't find too many clues to say that they will have that struggle about whether they're Texans, New Mexicans from Chihuahua. You find some accounts on their perception of Mexicans, which are interesting because, again, they hold like a strong political viewpoint. Some quotes that I didn't mention because if I really like to share quotes, but sometimes they will take too much time. When you see, for example, the discussions between Governor Donaciano Vigil and General and former Governor Manuel Armijo. When they talk, there's a letter where they talk a little bit about identity, but they do it in more general terms. For example, there's this letter when Vigil declared that he would rather be part of the United States. Armijo sends a letter to him saying that he's not surprised that he has chosen the American government. But then he makes this note, and I can't remember the exact words, but he says something on the lines of, I'm not surprised that you feel inclined towards the Republican government. That's what he calls it, the Republican government. But I'm surprised that you don't seem too frustrated or too saddened about the idea that you were once a Mexican citizen. And then he says something like, but I have to agree with you that even if I'm a general in Mexico, all I want is to have a government, about a solid and stable government. So in cultural terms, you find some quotes where people are talking about dealing with a new language, religion, customs. Actually, let me see if I have it here. There's a really interesting quote from one of the officials in Guadalupe, where he says that the New Mexican families moved because they were concerned about language, religion, and the customs of the Americans. But then he expresses his concern that the Mexican government doesn't seem to be interested in that because he's aware that the location of Guadalupe and San Ignacio is a location where Indian tribes will constantly come into the country to raid Chihuahua and Durango. So there's this sense, I will say, more of New Mexicans. At the time, it was common to have stronger local, regional affiliations than national. And I will say that during the first couple decades after the relocation, they had probably maintained most of that cultural identity as they were relocated into towns where they conformed the majority in most of the times. I don't know if I ran too much to respond that question.
No, complicated question, but you definitely addressed it, you definitely answered it. It's interesting that New Mexicans hold on to this particular identity, whereas others, they're not sort of caught up in the way that they think about it. So one last quick question.
Mhm.
You kind of just mentioned this, but I'm just curious, like, how do the Comanches sort of fit into this? Because the Comanches, this is all on the edge of the empire. And they constantly, they show raids, very late into the 19th century. And are they raiding any of these new communities? And is that disrupting any of these patterns or causing people to move too because of the Comanches?
It's hard to know which groups were raiding these groups. There was, of course, some raiding. And actually, you see, again, to that fluid border, if we want to call it that thing, is that those towns that remain on the American side, like San Elizario, Socorro, they're still in some sense forced to collaborate with these new towns because they're in that area that's very prone to raiding. In the records I found, they don't mention specific groups. Mexicans will just call them indios bárbaros, like savages. They won't really take the time to identify what group was doing the raiding. But when it comes to the Comanches, I know for one of the sources I was reading that uh, the Comanches, they're mostly in Texas, right? In what's today Texas. The And because there were many Comanche tribes, some of them will be very hostile. There are records of some Comanches being so pressured by the United States that they're actually asking for permission to settle some of these colonies in Mexican ground. I haven't been able to find information on whether that petition followed through, but they certainly happen. As well as in New Mexico, there's some records that talk about petitions that just haven't been able to corroborate if they follow through. For example, you have people moving from Mesilla to Ascension in 1872. just 7 years later, there were other 500 individuals from Mesilla asking for permission to relocate. But this time, the government in Chihuahua said no because it will be too expensive for them. Mhm.
How did the US federal government, I know it was brand new, but what did they think of these people? They consider them Americans, or they consider them Mexicans, or what do they have to say about aliens?
I haven't seen much of the voice of the federal government. There are some things that I find interesting, and I left them out because I think that will provide for a whole new presentation, the way that people are debating what the role of the New Mexicans will be. So something that happened in New Mexico is that even when some people didn't move back to Mexico, they decided to stay in the United States while keeping their Mexican citizenship. And for some of them, that was cultural. For some of them, it was a way, for some of them thought, because of the wording of some of the documents about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that circulated in New Mexico, they thought that by staying in New Mexico, being Mexicans, they could avoid like legal responsibilities. But the question is interesting because in newspapers, you find a lot of debate. There's one case of a Mexican citizen, someone who decided to keep Mexican citizenship, called Miguel Pino, I think in Santa Fe, who after a few years decided that now he wanted to take the American citizenship. And you can tell that that created some resentment for some people. There will be whole newspaper articles saying that, yes, there are people among the New Mexican populace that we will be proud to call Americans, but they need to do it in a different way, or they just didn't conceive this idea that like this artificial concept of citizen. And I say artificial because first of all, when you read the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when you read the drafts, one of the things that created a lot of discussion was that article, I think it was Article 5th, over the 1 year to decide to be American or Mexican, because for many officials in Washington, D.C., it was just not conceivable to say that a Mexican could stop being a Mexican to become an American. And it has a lot to do with racial connotations, right? You know, like if you're brown, how do you stop being Mexican and all of a sudden you're an American citizen with full rights? In the first place, that has a lot to do with why New Mexico had to wait 64 years to be considered a state on its own right. So I will say that even if I didn't see too much of a voice of the federal government, they certainly struggle to conceive the idea that all of a sudden you could give up one citizenship and acquire another because of those racial connotations. Mhm. Oh, nice.
How do you think uncertainties regarding the US acknowledgement of Spanish and Mexican land grants affect repatriation?
I think it was a huge deal, and I'm glad with this viewer who brought up that point, because now I just realized I didn't include it in the slide. It certainly had a lot to do. If I remember well, for example, 80% of the communal land grants in New Mexico were not really accepted by the federal government. And there's some accounts about people expressing their concerns when it comes to land. For example, when Ramon Ortiz was in New Mexico trying to enlist people interested in repatriation, he mentions that some of the people in San Miguel del Vado told him that they will rather give up anything they have in Mexico before being treated worse than the African race, which implies that they had a lot of concerns whether they will file, because there were two categories, right? They could either be citizens, as the white citizens of America, and the other category that they were familiar with was the enslaved community. Closer to the border, there's a lot of complaints or concerns being issued in Senecu, because something interesting about those towns south of El Paso is that they didn't initially fall into the ceded territory, but because the Rio Grande was declared the border, when the border shifted just 1 year later, now those towns fell into American jurisdiction. And when that happened, there were people in Senecu and the neighboring towns saying that they were really concerned because as soon as a change in the river was made known to officials, a lot of Americans, hoping that they will receive Texan land grants, were coming into the area. And it's not a surprise when you see, let me see if I can go back to the slide. When you see that those towns that fell into Texan jurisdiction in a region that already had a history with Texas and Texans trying to come in and claim land in the area. You can see, for example, in Guadalupe and San Elizario, Guadalupe and San Ignacio, 233 citizens from San Elizario. The last Mexican census of San Elizario listed 844 people in San Elizario. So we're saying that those towns that fell into Texan jurisdiction, they were closer to the border, yes, but also some of the land concerns that they had made the towns lose at least 25 to 35% of the population that they had before the change in the border. Yes.
In very broad terms,
Mhm.
what, we talk about the border and, part is the river and that's moving.
Mhm.
In broad terms, was it well defined, the border, and how was it controlled in those very early days? Probably very little, right?
Very little, yes. There's something interesting though. Of course, the people signing this treaty are people from Washington, D.C., people from Mexico City. They don't really know how this border, how this region works. So they just say, well, it's as easy as saying that the river will be a natural border. But something interesting is that there are some records about people in Mesilla trying to change the shift of the river. It is said that at some point Ramon Ortiz asked the residents in Mesilla to do work on the river, and apparently they did it so well to keep La Mesilla on the Mexican side, on what they thought was the Mexican side, that people in lower towns were having shortage of water. And at the same time, when the river changed in San Elizario and those towns, some governmental officials in Chihuahua were saying, well, the residents of those towns are to blame because they did nothing to try to impede that, as people in Mesilla once did.
List of people that move back and forth, Santa Rita de Cobre.
Yes.
And, for a long time, yes, there was a border, but I think it was really easy to go back and forth.
Mhm.
And so my grandfather, I'm not sure where he was born, but he crossed the border to work in Santa Rita de Cobre. And there were a lot of Mexicans that came to work there, because I guess that a lot of that copper was sent to Chihuahua for whatever they do to the smelting, I guess is what they did in Chihuahua. But, the whole family came and, with him after a while. My mother never got American citizenship until I decided to run for office, and she decided she wanted to vote for me, and she became a citizen.
Well, there was an issue too, because in the way that treaty was formulated, you will become an American citizen by omission. If you went to the office and listed your name, it's because you wanted to remain Mexican. And it's probably very intentional because, of course, a lot of the people didn't have the means to go, let's say, to Santa Fe just to have their name put in the list saying that they want to remain Mexican. So, and about Santa Rita del Cobre, it's not surprising because after during the 1830s, raiding came very common in that area. So the mine operations were not as constant as they used to be. So if you're having that issue being from Santa Rita del Cobre, and now the Mexican government offers you free land in more populated areas, it sounds like a good deal, or at least a better chance of survival in that time.
So how did New Mexico's territorial status fit into this? Because if we're trying to become part of the United States and get that fundamental protection of being citizens, how did that also factor into this idea of like being a Mexican or being an American when the very territory that some people are in is in flux or it's in this gray area?
I've seen that being a discussion that corresponds more to people of higher class. For example, I've seen one of the most interesting accounts when it comes to those discussions about whether the US, or Mexico, it comes from a Father Leiva from San Miguel del Vado, who is writing to Donaciano Vigil. And it's probably one of the best accounts in how it mixes like cultural and political concerns, because he says something on the lines of, if it is true that New Mexico, no, I'm not going to remember the whole quote, but I can remember most of it. It says something on the lines of, you know my position regarding the integrity of the Mexican Republic, but if it's true that New Mexico is lost and it's part of the United States, then I want it to be a state equal to those states of Washington. And then he proceeds to say, well, good luck, but I'm too old to learn the language and the law, so I'm going to return to Mexico. All right. Well, thank you very much.
See the same guy that is part of the Maxwell Landry? Does he marry into that family? Is that the same guy?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so
Yes.
because he becomes extremely rich on that whole thing.
He's part of that land grab. He is listed among the founders of Doña Ana.
Yeah, of course.
Uh,
That guy's all over the place.
He was all
I
over
had no
the
idea that
place.
he had this like political career. That's all like kind of used to. Because I